Okay. FYI, the Zoom webinar function will be recording this, and then we'll be able to do some editing of it later, and at that point we'll upload it to our webpage. So if there's anything that you have in your slides that you want to ensure is made visible, we can, it's not made visible, we can make sure to obscure that for anything that you don't want publicly available at this point, or anything that's yet to be published that you do share in the meeting. Just let us know and we can edit that to make sure that it's not shared publicly.
Okay.
And I see people are starting to show up for the webinar. Great. I know it's a good day outside, so I'm glad to see everybody showing up. Very nice. Okay, then I think we can start now. I want to first greet everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. And it's always exciting when we have one of our distinguished presenters join us to discuss their research. Before we start with the presentation, I first want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping, a few items. If you want to share a comment, you can do so in the chat. You can type something there. And that's up to you, but I can tell you that we won't be monitoring the chat for Q&A. And if you have a question for our presenter, please enter that in the Q&A chat text box function, and then we'll address those afterwards. We'll be holding questions as well after the presentation is completed. And at that point, we'll start the Q&A. In addition, we do have captioning available. And if you would prefer to use that and read that and an external link, I can put the chat in there so you can have it on a separate page and watch the captioning stream. So let me share that now. Okay. And I think with that, we can begin with our formal introduction. I'm the speaker, and for that, I'm going to ask Christina to join us on screen. If you would. Your camera doesn't seem to be working, Christina. Please hold for technical difficulties. Okay, there we go. Great. And with that, I'll take myself off screen. Go right ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the PhD in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lectures series, which we will call the DLS. This is hosted by Gallaudet University. The goal of this lecture series is to honor world-renowned scientists in the fields of psychology, education, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience. These different fields and all of the interdisciplinary fields in between contribute to the new and growing fields of educational neuroscience, and they increase our understanding of the human mind and the neural mechanisms of learning. This year's Distinguished Lecture Series theme is the neuroscience of language, creativity, emotion, and their contribution to learning. I am honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, which we will sign as IY. Dr. Immordino-Yang received her educational doctorate at Harvard University and completed a postdoc at the University of Southern California, where she currently works. She has a variety of different roles at USC. She is a professor of education and the Fahmy and Donna Attallah Chair in Humanistic Psychology. She is a professor of psychology at the Brain and Creativity Institute. And she's a faculty member for the Neuroscience Graduate Program and a founding director of the USC Center for Affective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education. Dr. Immordino-Yang is very well regarded as a scientist in the field of educational neuroscience and was president of the International Mind, Brain, and Educational Society in 2016 to 2018. She's an accomplished author, publishing dozens of peer-reviewed scientific articles, and wrote a book titled Emotions, Learning, and the Brain, Exploring the Educational Implications of Affective Neuroscience. One second, excuse me. Seems as though there's some technical difficulties going on.
Okay, I see people are having trouble seeing our presenter, the interpreters, or anything at all. So at this point, there's no interpreter on screen, and we only have myself, Dr. Immordino-Yang, and Christina on screen. Not sure what's happening. Okay, it seems as though people aren't able to see us. Okay, it appears we have the issue fixed now. Apologies all. Okay, I'm not sure what happened or how the Zoom was set up differently than it was last time. But at any rate, perhaps we should start over. Christina, would you mind terribly? I think people have missed the introduction.
No, that's completely fine. Just give me 1 second here. All right, hopefully we're all set to start again. So again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the PhD in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lecture Series. This is hosted by Gallaudet University, and this lecture series aims to honor world-renowned scientists in the fields of psychology, education, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience. These different fields, and all of the interdisciplinary fields in between, contribute to the new and growing field of educational neuroscience, and they increase our understanding of the human mind and the neural mechanisms of learning. This year's Distinguished Lecture Series theme is the neuroscience of language, creativity, and emotion and their contribution to learning. I'm now honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, which we will sign as IY. Dr. Immordino-Yang received her educational doctorate at the Harvard University and completed a postdoc at the University of Southern California, where she currently works. She has many roles at USC, one as a professor of education and Fahmy and Donna Attallah Chair in Humanistic Psychology, 2 as a professor of psychology at the Brain and Creativity Institute, 3, as a faculty member at the Neuroscience Graduate Program, and as a founding director of the USC Center for Affective Neuroscience, Development, Learning, and Education. She is very well regarded as a scientist in the field of educational neuroscience and was the president of the International Mind, Brain, and Educational Society in 2016 to 2018. She's also an accomplished author, publishing dozens of peer-reviewed scientific articles. She also wrote a book entitled Emotions, Learning, and the Brain, exploring the educational implications of affective neuroscience. Dr. Immordino-Yang is currently a distinguished scientist on the Aspen Institute's National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, and is also appointed to the National Academies Committee on the Science and Practice of Learning. Dr. Immordino-Yang is known for using interdisciplinary approaches to research the psychological and neurobiological development of social emotion. This includes how we integrate cognition and emotion in formal and informal education to develop identities, intrinsic motivation, thorough understanding of knowledge, and creative, ethical, and abstract thought. Her work focuses on developing diverse adolescents from under-resourced communities and elevates the adolescents themselves as junior scientists in her research. Dr. Immordino-Yang has received multiple research grants to support her work, including a prestigious NSF Career Award. We are thrilled to have Dr. Immordino-Yang here today to share her work on understanding the adolescent brain and the complex educational and social contexts that shape development. Today's presentation. One second, sorry about that. Today's presentation is titled Building Meaning Builds Teens' Brains. And so now please join me in welcoming Dr. Immordino-Yang. It's truly an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Christina. That was wonderful. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to share with you some of the work that we've been doing. I'm going to share my screen. Maybe I can get a thumbs up from somebody that it's actually working. Let's say, oh, host disabled screen sharing. Could the host enable screen sharing? I'm still getting a message that it's disabled. It's okay. I can't hear the interpreter, just so you know.
Yep, just 1 second. We're seeing how we can fix that on the back end.
Okay. No problem.
Okay, if you don't mind trying one more time for us.
Sure. Let me see what happens. Oh, looks like it's gonna work. Here we go. Okay, are you seeing the slides? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm not sure how far we'll get. I've put more in here than we could talk about, especially given some of the technical issues. No problem. I've titled today's talk Building Meaning Builds Teens' Brains because I thought it would be interesting to focus on some new work that we're just about to submit for publication, in which we show, which is, I think, pretty astounding. It actually really surprises me that the findings actually work. That the way that teenagers think about the world, the complexity and curiosity and sort of dispositions for engaging with deep thinking that they bring allows us to predict the development of the inner network connectivity that will happen in the subsequent several years. And that brain development, not the talking, not the way they think at the beginning directly, but the brain development that is predicted by the way they're showing us that they're engaging with the world, is actually predicting how happy they are as young adults, how much they like themselves, how much identity achievement in the Ericksonian terms, how satisfied they are with a whole range of relationships in their life, how well they're doing at school or work, whatever it is that they are doing at that time. So this is an incredibly powerful, I think, statement in an educational neuroscience context, because it shines the light back around on the thinkers themselves as agents of their own development, this notion of sort of autopoiesis in development, this self-actualization through thinking. And then the question is going to be for education, how do we take these findings, given the neural networks that are involved, given the ways that we know that those operate in dynamic contexts, in psychological, all kinds of different psychological processing, how do we then take that information back and start to understand what counts as meaningful learning experiences for young people, especially for adolescents, middle and high school kids? So I'm going to start by kind of giving a broad introduction to the brain regions that are most involved, to the big ideas behind the work, and then we're going to kind of deep dive into the work with the teens. And then if we have time, which I don't know if we will, I'll show you some of the work that we've been doing with neuroimaging and psychophysiological recording with the teachers from low SES high school and middle school contexts, with observations in their classrooms and with them engaging in authentic teaching tasks in the lab, and then engaging in deep interviews with us around the way they understand their own role in young people's development and learning. And what we find is that there are these kind of synergies between the ways that effective teachers think about the nature of their interactions with young people and the ways that young people's patterns of thinking are appearing to actually predict. They definitely predict whether they cause. I actually think there's good reason to think they might even cause, but that's not proven yet, cause development in the brain. So I'm going to jump right in. I started the talk with this painting by a colleague of mine, Margaret Lazari, who is the chair of the Fine Arts Department at USC. Before she retired, and she and I were talking on the bus one day on our way to campus, and decided it would be fun to do some kind of collaboration. Because I was studying the way people make meaning, the way that systems for affect and consciousness and cognition are organized by cultural patterns of interaction, and the ways in which those are then contributing to the narratives that we construct, the complex feeling states that become our identity, that become our understanding, our narratives around the world, as it is now, as it's been, as it will be, right? The possible potential futures that we imagine. And so what we did was we took some of our brain imaging data, from one very brave subject, an MRI. We peeled all the cortex off the outside, right? We peeled it off the picture, right? Not the person. You guys would know that in this audience, but I always have to say that in lay audiences. And then, gave her basically the white matter fiber tracks data, the pictures of those white matter fiber tracks underneath. And she painted them into this amazing seascape of life. And I love this as a metaphor for understanding the functioning and the development of the brain, because we often think of the brain as being kind of encapsulated in the skull, separate from the rest of the body and world. And we put on our special scientist glasses and we study it in a little bucket in the corner. And in fact, the way that the brain actually works and grows is by being deeply ensconced in a living organism who is also deeply ensconced in the relational and community and cultural contexts that surround them. And those things all together are synergistically shaping the functioning, the development, the adaptations of that brain and body to produce phenotypes that are then engaged over time and changed over time as the person goes about living. And so what Margaret's done is painted these squigglies, sort of floating semi-translucent in this seascape of life, and she's got it sort of sloshing back and forth in the ocean that's holding it up, and she's got little weeds underneath tickling it, and little red fish swimming by to represent the spontaneity of our creative ideas and the warm sun shining on it and all these things. And it's that metaphor, that visual analogy that I want you to bring to the work that I'm about to present. That I don't think of the brain as being a thing that's sort of doing stuff. I think of us as engaged, and the neurobiological dynamics and cultural dynamics and social dynamics and cognitive aspects and emotional aspects are all just different dimensions of the same dynamic system. I don't see them as distinct. Of course, as scientists, we carve them into distinct things and we look at them independently, and that's fantastic. That's how we can do the kinds of work that allows us to understand mechanisms, processes, but we need to remember that when we're in an educational context, there's no such thing as a supramarginal gyrus in your second grade classroom. There's a kid who is engaging with trying to learn how to read, and all of the dynamics of who they are, including the kind of brain and the kind of life and experience and culture and emotion that they bring to that space, is dynamically shaping the entirety of that endeavor. And so I think a major hurdle for the field of educational neuroscience is to begin to put the pieces back together. Sometimes I give a talk that I call Solving the Frankenstein Problem, which my friend David Daniel came up with as an idea. I mean, because we think of the science as dividing things into parts, which is a very useful intellectual exercise, but in the real world, that's not how people function. And teachers are often expected to stitch it all back together in order to have an evidence-based approach without making a monster. And I think that we really need to be mindful in the ways that we think about how our work is conducted and how it's presented to help with that problem. So I'm just gonna put out this. Don't try to read this unless you're like a kindergarten teacher. But this is a little song that my daughter wrote for her baby brother Theodore when she was in kindergarten, and I just give it as an example of what I mean of the ways that children's work is not, and thinking is not, cognitive, affective, cultural, social, in different ways. It's all of those things at once. So here's a picture of Nora there with her little dress, and she's got her music stand and she's singing to her baby brother, and she says, "Oh, Teddy, we love you more than the whole earth size. As the earth spins every day, we love you as much as usual. But sometimes even more, as you make us proud and happy that you're you." So I have a simple question for you. Is this a song about this little girl's love for her baby brother? Or is this a song about her budding interest in planetary science? Right? Those two things are not separate. They come together. She's using her feelings for her baby brother, those emotions, to give sort of analogy to these new concepts about the planet she's on, which are very difficult to really cognitively appreciate. And she's integrating those two together as a way to both express her love for her baby brother and to understand the sort of affective dimensions of information about the Earth, right? And I'm happy to report that she's now in college studying both English and planetary and health sciences. So there you go. So I'm gonna show a quick video right now of a little segment from a NOVA episode in which our work was featured, just because it gives you a sense of kind of how we do the work. For those of you who don't use neuroimaging in your work, we have a paradigm that I've built out over the years in which we pair in-depth interviews, which are videotaped, and then we code in various ways with neuroimaging data and psychophysiology data, but those aren't featured in this special. And then we can look for systematic correspondences between the ways that people make meaning, the developmental, cultural, affective, cognitive, individual variability in those ways of making meaning, and systematic biases or features of the neurobiological data as a kind of window into the undergirding complexities of the processes that produce complex mental states like narratives and feelings that I'm interested in understanding. So I'm going to play a little bit of this for you.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Mary Helen. Nice to meet you.
Since her days as a teacher, University of Southern California neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino-Yang has been interested in knowing how emotions factor into learning.
I quickly realized that there was very, very little known about the kind of stuff that we really care about in education, like how people become inspired. How do we become interested in things? How do we build curiosity? And how can we support that process?
In trying to identify which parts of the brain are involved in the deepest and most meaningful learning, Immordino-Yang works with teens from troubled neighborhoods.
We're going to be watching stories. We really want to know what you think, so there's no right or wrong answers. These are kids who see a lot of crime, they see a lot of dangerous things, they see a lot of poverty. And we wanted to understand, how do they make meaning of that world around them? This first one is a story about a girl who lives in Savat, Pakistan. And the city was being taken over and basically run by a group called the Taliban. So I want you to watch her when she was 12 years old.
First, she gets them emotionally engaged in a topic by showing them videos about people struggling to overcome adversity.
And I want to become a doctor.
So how does her story make you feel?
This story makes me feel upset how she wants to be a doctor and continue on with her education, but it makes her sad that knowing her journey would be very difficult.
For adolescents, these types of stories can trigger moments of deep reflection.
They come back from those kind of reflective moments with this heightened appreciation of the meaning of the story and what it applies to in their own life and what it means for the nature of the world more broadly.
And it's crazy how it's that powerful.
Whereas we've known that for a long time in education, the neural data are giving us new insights into the mechanics of that process. Over here.
To find out which brain regions are harnessed during reflective emotion, Immordino-Yang monitors the students' brain activity as they re-watch the emotional videos in an fMRI scanner.
Hi, Attallah, how you doing in there?
Good.
So we're looking at the movement of the blood flow in her brain as she's watching the stories, and where in her brain is becoming more and less active as she's experiencing these emotions.
She found that the reflective thinking caused by these emotional videos triggers widespread activity throughout the brain.
The most high-level brain states that people experience in the scanner don't just activate high-level systems. They also activate lower level structures of the brain that are involved in regulating and monitoring your consciousness and your survival.
Immordino-Yang believes that the reason why learning and emotion seem so intimately connected is because complex emotion, like admiration, can activate basic brain functions, like those regulating breathing and heart rate.
We think that the reason that humans' values and belief systems and ideals are such powerful motivators is literally that they're hooking themselves into biomechanical machinery that has evolved to keep us alive over time. So emotions are a critical piece of learning always. Meaningful learning, learning that really matters to you, that changes who you are and that endures over time, always has an emotional component.
So I would draw upon any of these.
Her research shows that engaging students on an emotional level makes for more powerful learning experiences.
Okay. So
One moment while we switch interpreters.
Sure.
Thank you. Go right ahead.
So the big idea that I want you to take out of that first is just how we do the work in a very broad way that led us to the findings that I'm about to show you. And then also that even though emotions can be automatic, neural and bodily responses to situations, the things you notice about the world or inside your own mind about ideas or memories, right? In a sense, what development is about is learning how to feel, not what to feel, but the processes by which you engage in interpreting the emotions you have, which of course are in reaction to and part of thoughts that you're having, right? How do you come to interpret those feelings as narratives that become part of the experience of the world that you have and the sort of what you might call transcendent meaning you make about emotional cognitive concepts that become the story of who you are and the frame from which you understand the world. So ideas like identity, like belonging, like interest in physics, right? Whatever it is, those ideas get their power. The cognition gets its power when it's tied into, integrated into a story that the person is constructing inside their mind that is the understanding of that content on the one hand, and is also their interest and emotional sort of experience of thinking about that content. On the other hand, the feeling of thinking is something that I talk a lot about as something we need to pay attention to in school contexts. What does it feel like to think about this information? What are the emotions that kids are having about? Not what are the emotions, but what are they about? What do they pertain to? Do they pertain to the why the ball's rolling down the ramp and what's actually going on? Or do they pertain to some other kind of ancillary administrative aspect of the reason why you're watching that ball roll, which is really an important distinction because you remember things and you learn about things that you are engaged with thinking about, and you think about the things you're having emotion about. So what are the emotions about? So what we basically showed, and this part I'll go through rather quickly because now this has been shown in exquisite detail by many labs in many ways. But what my little nephew here is revealing is that emotions, especially complex emotions that are of the sort that are not just reactions to what you see, oh, poor Malala, like that looks terrible, she's sad, I'm going to be sad too, and have empathy for her, right? But the story that you start to tell yourself about what that means for what's good or right or true in the world, right? And what that means for what you should do or appreciate differently potentially, which you'll see an example of that in a moment. The emotions that are part of that interpretive narrative that you're constructing, which becomes your deep thinking and your story of what is happening, your understanding of what happens, even those emotions are actively recruiting systems in the brain whose, so to speak, day job is to feel and regulate consciousness and the visceral body. And so I think this has very important implications for the ways in which emotion could be understood as driving, organizing the process of thinking, with implications for learning on the one hand, but even more importantly than for learning, for development, for the way in which people actually become something different for the experience of having thought about this content. And so, you know, if we want to take and just plop in an educational implication here before we go on, I think what this means is that we really need to pay close attention to the ways that our learning opportunities in school are not the outcome. We focus on learning as the outcome, but learning is not the end point of school. Learning is the means. The outcome should be development. The outcome should be the growth of the capacities and dispositions of those people in the system. And so that's the leap that I think that these data help us to make. We can talk more about it at the end. I'll just take you really quickly into the brain. I imagine many of you are familiar with these systems in the brain, but what we basically find, and these data are from the first study that we used this method when I was a postdoc, where I put together documentary stories about real people and asked, this was adults actually in these data from 18 to 60 years old, to react to those stories in an interview. And then we moved them into the scanner and had them react again. And they pushed buttons in real time to tell us how strongly emotionally engaged they were with the story at that moment. And then there were stories of different kinds. But the bottom line is, it turns out that no matter what kind of story the person's reacting to, when they say they are deeply emotionally engaged with it by their own account in real time, we get activations in brain systems that are involved in basic survival and embodied sensation. And, you know, so this is a map of just the group level contrast between I feel really emotional about this versus I really don't feel that engaged with this right now. And unbeknownst to them, there are stories mixed in that are meant to be more banal and less compelling, but still true and, you know, a little bit interesting. And so what we basically see here is activations in very systematic nuclei in the mesencephalon and medulla in the brainstem. I mean, these are regions in the mesencephalon here that are involved in, you know, basically intermediating between the cortex, right, and the subcortex on the one hand, and the spinal cord on the other, to go out into the body and face and back into the body, back into the brain again. So this is like the bottleneck that is the densely packed nuclei, that is the relay station between the brain and the rest of you. And what we find is that these systems are systematically activated in patterns that can be sort of described, despite that we're controlling for psychophysiological activation at the same time. So it's not due to just a physiological artifact. We actually see activations in these regions. You know, these are regions, especially here in the medulla. I mean, if you get damage in the system that's, you know, inside where this spot is, like, we can't even keep you alive on life support. You short of defibrillating your heart with every beat, you know, you become quickly dysregulated and die. You get damage in the medulla, I mean, in the midbrain, in the mesencephalon, you get all kinds of things like persistent vegetative state and coma or death, depending on the extent of the damage. So really, this isn't just metaphor. We're actually activating these systems that are involved in very, very basic life regulatory functions. And we're also getting these systematic activations in visceral somatosensory and somatomotor regions, like the anterior insula being a classic one, anterior and middle insula shown in these pictures. And then we went on to show, that there's cultural variation in how these activities are experienced as emotion and all kinds of other developmental and inter-individual variability in how emotion corresponds to these activations. But the bottom line is that our feeling of thinking about complex, powerful ideas is activating and sort of playing itself out on the same brain systems that are also feeling what you digested for lunch, or telling you if you have a stomach ache or if your heart's pounding. And so this leads to a kind of confluence of embodied emotional and active thinking that I think is really important for us to be cognizant of as we design educational and developmental environments for young people and for teachers. Anterior middle cingulate also, a region that's involved in pain perception, but also in visceral somatomotor management. It's the system that's involved in subtle calculations around things like thirst and satiety, right? So if a mouse is super thirsty and you give it water and it drinks the water, it stops drinking long before its blood has actually got the water into it to decrease the concentration that the hypothalamus is kind of tasting. Why do you stop drinking, or the mouse stop drinking before the blood has actually been more diluted? It's because your brain is doing all kinds of calculations about the feeling of the water going down and and what that's likely to lead to in terms of changes in blood concentration over time. And so your brain is calculating these appetitive and satiated kinds of feelings for you. And these are the same systems that are involved when people are thinking about complex emotional content, also the same systems whose activity and functional connectivity is giving us information about, for example, math problem solving for Montessori versus traditionally schooled kids in Geneva and things. That was work that was done by Solange Desnervaux in my lab a few years ago. So these systems, that kind of thing, is part of both error monitoring, right? When you're learning a problem or you're doing something and you think, oh wait, that's not right, or oh yeah, I know how to do that. And it's also involved in all kinds of embodied processing. So we really see this deep connection between the feeling of me in the literal sense and the feeling of thinking in the metaphorical sense. But where I want to take you now is somewhere a little more new and interesting. So the idea here is that we've found that, and now there are many, many, many papers that are also finding, that have also found the same kind of pattern, that only some kinds of stories and emotional feelings activated these systems that we call the default mode network, right? Which and what we basically find, we know a lot about the default mode network now, and I imagine that in this audience you already do, so I won't talk about it too much. But basically the idea is that there's this coherent set of regions that are kind of co-regulating one another, and there are sub-networks within it and all that kind of stuff. But there are these coherent sets of regions whose dynamic activity is correlated. And what we think is happening is that these regions are becoming sort of engaged in a concerted way as people are engaging in the kinds of thinking that you can basically think of as not being in the here and now. And so I wrote a paper in Perspectives in Psychological Science in 2012 that we called Rest is Not Idleness, which was basically about the psychological implications and the educational and developmental implications of the balancing of these networks. And you can go look and read more there, although it's getting a little out of date now. But the idea is that the default mode network systems are activated when you are doing a kind of internally based, either sort of awareness of self or mind wandering, remembering, prospecting about the future, thinking about all manner of content that basically can't be directly perceived from the world. And so we have a series of other papers showing that things like inspiration and awe come from the sort of withdrawal from real perceptual input. People close their eyes, they look away, and as they do those things, they're activating these systems that are involved in a kind of deep core feeling of being psychologically aware of yourself, of having a core sense of sort of purpose, or determination, motivation, deep intrinsic motivation, people describe, and at the same time, these broader, more what we're going to call transcendent ways of making meaning. So meaning that transcends any particular context, that is true in general, and that explains things in many kinds of contexts, but that can't be directly observed. Things like values and beliefs and identities and understandings of concepts like gravity, right, are engaging this system in concert with others. So that's going to be really important to understanding the longitudinal findings that I'm about to show you. So if we go back to Attallah here as an example from the Nova, so she says a bunch of things that you heard her say, but then she goes on and says a bunch of other stuff, which which isn't included in the episode, but which gives us a really nice example of the ways in which we were able to code for particular ways of thinking about or making meaning of those stories that turns out to have this amazing predictive power for the ways that these networks are interrelating with one another, coordinating with one another, both trial by trial, the day that they watch the stories and then move into the scanner, we can predict based on how kids react to the story, a particular story, how complexly, abstractly, transcendently they engage with that particular story. So that they say, oh, poor girl in Pakistan, I feel so bad for her, that's really terrible, right? Is one kind of very direct response. They can also then say, wait a minute, and they do wait, they have to slow down and say like, that I didn't know not everybody in the world gets to go to school. Like I go to school every day and I just took it for granted, but well, that's not right. And then they go on from there. That kind of sort of transcendent inferential meaning making turns out to be very key. It's characteristic to adolescence, that's really coming online in adolescence. This has been described for 100 years in psychology, and what we're showing is that it actually seems to be engaging key networks of the brain in systematic ways that are predicting growth and happiness over time. You heard her say what's on the screen now, and I'll put up the rest of what she says. Okay, and so if you think about what's in yellow, it's very direct. This story makes me feel upset. She wants to be a doctor, but blah, 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 right? These things that are true about that girl right now. But then that word powerful gives you this sense that there's something that is powerful, not in the story, but in the meaning the girl is making of that story, the implications of that story for her own life, for what's right or good in the world is, I think, what she means. And then she pauses and she comes back, and the stuff in green is about that own person. It makes me think about my own journey. And we see that a lot. We see this kind of self and other being sort of back to back in this kind of transcendent thinking. And I don't think it's an accident that both of these are using systems of the default mode that are also known to be involved in processing of self and self-awareness, right? Makes me think about my own journey. And then she starts getting into these more abstract things. So I'll let you read.
We'll go ahead and switch at this point too.
So what you see is she,
One moment. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
sure, what you see is that she gets increasingly what we're calling transcendent. She says, I guess what really hits me is how not everyone is able to get this chance, right? She's making these broader sort of inferences out of the story, which the story did not say. And then she starts to, from there, have these ethical and personal reflections on the meaning for the world. You know, everyone everywhere should have the chance, right? Like, how transcendent is that? How that is really about what ought to be true and good and right, not about that girl that you just watched, right? All human beings, right, should be able to do this. And so we're watching kids move into this deeper space where they're constructing these inferential things. And what we find is that, and these are the actual kids in the experiment, right? What we find is that the degree to which kids think in those coarsely two ways, and there's a really nice paper in Journal of Adolescent Research last year where we actually lay out the way we coded for 65 different things. This is Rebecca Gottlieb's dissertation research, and ran principal components analysis to show that there are actually two big factors in those data, the ways that kids are talking, and those two things are associated with different affordances in the kid's social life, but also with different neural mechanisms and different neural predictive patterns. So what we find, so this is a contrast showing in yellow more of these sort of empathic, what I'm calling looking out, because you look at the person to know how to feel about them. And so the more kids talked like, oh, poor her, the more they showed activity in these places, which we all recognize as the executive control network or the central executive network. What's interesting is that these kind of direct looking out responses are uncorrelated with the more transcendent ones. So kids could do a lot of both of them. It's not like you do one or the other. Kids are doing both to varying degrees. And kids who did this more and said, oh, poor her, more, also had better relationships, had better acceptance of diversity in their daily lives. Their teachers liked them, they're not in trouble, all these kinds of things. And then kids could also, and again, this is uncorrelated, and by the way, both of these things are also uncorrelated with IQ, which I think is quite interesting. Okay, it's not about IQ. It's even not even strongly correlated with age, which is interesting. There are responses where kids are being more invoking of beliefs and values and curiosities. The more kids said, wait a minute, like, I didn't know everybody in the world doesn't get to go to school. That's not right. Everyone everywhere, right? Those things, the more they show activation in these canonical regions that we know are associated with the default mode. And the more, you know, creative and thoughtful their ideas about solving community problems. When we ask them to propose solutions to the violence and crime they've witnessed in their communities, they're much more realistic, they're much more complex in their perspective taking, and much more able to appreciate the multiple perspectives at play in these crimes, why people get involved in gangs and things like that. And they also just have better scores on things like standardized, you know, tests of like how many ways can you use a brick, right? And so what we find is that there's this intriguing pattern, and this was published in Scan last year, where story by story, the kid's response to a particular story allows us to predict for that story when they get in the scanner and watch it again and tell us how they're feeling about it in real time, by pushing buttons, that that sort of abstract or transcendent way of thinking is predicting increased activity in the default mode trial by trial. But what's really interesting is that the relationship between default mode activity and the level of transcendent or abstract thinking that the kid gave to that story, that correspondence is statistically strengthened by concurrent activity early in the trial in the executive control network. So only very early that comes on and says, whoa, I got to really think about this. This isn't a daydream default mode. This is a like concerted effort default mode, right? So that the executive control network comes on early, then profoundly deactivates. Each of those things is associated with strengthening the relationship between the default mode systems and the thinking. And if the kid says they're really strongly emotionally engaged at that moment, we get even stronger predictive power. So the emotion is basically, in the context of this abstract or transcendent thinking, appearing to drive the processes of brain that are involved in learning. So we actually have a study showing that 5 years later, when we ask the kids what they remember about the stories, the more transcendently they talked about the story, the more likely they were to remember it 5 years later too. There was no evidence of this part for the concrete thinking. So the concrete thinking is good for everyday relationships, but it's not really great for memory, for growing yourself over time. So you need both. And adolescents' sort of propensities to talk abstractly in the interview. So we also did resting state scans with the kids, right? So they would just lay there for 9 minutes while we take pictures of your brain. You can think about whatever you want. Please don't fall asleep. Just have a nice nature scene with no people or animals or anything in it, and you can just relax there. And we did that, and then we brought the kids back 2 years later and had them do that resting state scan again. And we look at the levels of interconnectivity between these key networks that are involved in transcendent thinking, which is here the executive control and the default mode. And what we find is that the level of coordination between those networks in resting state is not associated significantly with transcendent thinking. But whether or not you control for the starting state of the connectivity, the growth in the connectivity between those networks, the positive change in the connectivity at rest between those networks is significantly robustly related to the degree of transcendent thinking the kid was doing. So in other words, it looks like no matter what kind of brain you have, no matter your IQ, the more you engage in this deep kind of looking for meaning in the world, you are potentially actively coordinating these networks. And as you coordinate them over time, you may be growing their ability to coordinate with each other. And then what we find is that that coordinated connectivity in turn is predicting young adult outcomes. So this is a very rough diagram of the findings, which we're just submitting for publication in the next week, maybe. But what we basically find is across this stage of late adolescence, which, by the way, there's a lot of subtle brain network development going on in this stage, but we don't really know what accounts for it. Earlier in childhood, IQ and socioeconomic status and things like that are associated with brain development. At this point, they aren't anymore. Their effects sort of are attenuated. And our hypothesis is that the really powerful or a really powerful a source of variation in brain development at this point is the kid's own proclivity to think about complex issues. And so, and then of course that's malleable, it's context dependent, and schooling can be designed to support it, which I can show you at the end if we have time, which we won't, but that's okay, I can tell you a little bit. So what we basically find is that this default mode and executive control network and salience network, right, insula and those, but those are not in this analysis, are being actively coordinated in ways that are in real time predicting that the person has is building this sort of transcendent or abstract construal of the story as compared to a more direct, concrete, context-dependent construal. And then in turn, those construals, those ways of building that bigger meaning, saying, wait a minute, that's not right, everyone everywhere, right, should have the chance. That does not predict the psychosocial outcomes directly, but it predicts the change in the connectivity between these networks over time. it turns out it's the left ECN that it predicts. We can make post hoc guesses about why. We didn't have a hypothesis as to laterality, but it's the default mode with the left ECN. Those two talking to each other and sort of coordinating actively, even at rest, the change in that coordination across the 2 years is mediating the effect of the transcendent thinking on things like identity development in young adulthood or late adolescence. So these are classic measures that have been modernized that are originally made by Erickson. Like I've spent time thinking about what I believe in and who I am, and discussing important questions about who I am and with people I care about. Questions like that, as compared to identity diffusion, which it negatively predicts, which is things like, I don't really have any strong convictions. I kind of just hang with the crowd, right? Which is bad for you. It's bad for you. And then what we find is that when we follow up with these young people in their early 20s, when they're really emerging adults, what we find is that these identity development measures, and this isn't surprising given what's already known in the developmental literature, these identity development measures are in turn predicting things like academic achievement, life satisfaction in relationships with self, with school, with work. So in other words, the brain development that we think is a kind of, pattern that kids are actively potentially growing as they are engaging in these dispositional ways of thinking about the world, is enabling a more stable, interconnected, coordinated state of brain as they grow, which is in turn potentially supporting their satisfaction with themselves, their ability to manage close relationships in ways that feel good, their ability to find opportunities and to stick with those opportunities that they feel are most important or meaningful to them. All the kinds of outcomes that we most care about for kids. And so these data we're writing up right now, but just to quickly show, IQ predicts cortical thickness change over the 2 years in basically the medial temporal lobe and some core regions of the default mode. But abstract talk, that transcendent talk, whether or not we control for IQ, is predicting all thickness in the frontal lobe, in the medial parietal, in the anterior insular, like all these regions that are involved in regulation of complex thinking. We also find that IQ does not predict changes in fractional anisotropy, in basically the quality of fiber tracts that are connecting the brain, white matter fiber tracts, but transcendent thinking predicts the increase in the quality of those tracts over the 2 years. And this is controlling for all the demographic variables like SES, parents' education level, gender, age, starting level of brain, whatever it is that we're measuring, all that. So in other words, thinking deeply, I think I'll just take it back to education and then end. Thinking deeply is essentially telling kind of complex emotional stories to yourself, and the proclivities to engage in that kind of deep thinking appear to be potentially growing the brain over time. We haven't proven these things causally yet, but it's consistent with causality. And we have various kinds of studies that are in progress right now to look at what this actually looks like in schools that are really designed around promoting these ways of deep thinking for both very low SES marginalized kids, for example, kids who are justice involved in the Los Angeles area, and for high SES privileged kids both. So I just want to give you a little example of what these shifts kind of look like intuitively. So we ran a science summer camp for low SES inner city kids, very low SES, a couple of years ago, where they, we basically put posters up around town, and kids could choose to sign up. We had like 98 kids try to sign up for our free neuroscience summer camp. 10th to 12th graders, incoming 10th to 12th graders. We could only take 20, so we picked kids from the very lowest circumstances, so kids who are living in homeless shelters or things like that. And so at the beginning, we asked the kids before they did our whole camp, where they were trying on all the equipment and figuring out, telling each other stories, trying to watch their physiology, trying to figure out how emotion shapes thinking, for all this stuff. We asked them, what's a scientist to you? Like, this was one of the interview questions we had for them at the beginning, just in a private little interview. And kids said things like this. I'll put it up for you. All very appearance and action oriented, right? I always wonder why, if they think a scientist doesn't have proper health and is a nerd and is antisocial and doesn't have fun, why they want to be a scientist. But that's beside the point. These are the same kids, after actually doing science, they'd shifted their sort of appearance action oriented, what can you do, what do you look like, to a more dispositional, intrinsic, sort of inferential way of thinking about what counts as a scientist. These are the same kids' answers 3 weeks later. Right? So it's not true that being curious makes you a scientist. You actually have to learn a lot of things. But boy, having an internal disposition to engage with the world in terms of others' ideas, caring about it, being curious about it, being able to figure out things when they don't work out the first time, is a much better starting point than having a lab coat and being nerdy and being fast at thinking about the periodic table. Let's just skip that. So the big idea here that we take away is that meaningful learning is learning that shifts teachers and students away from emotions that are about outcomes or results, to focus instead on emotions that are about the ideas themselves. So we can talk about in the Q&A what that actually can look like. But what we need to ask ourselves as we design curriculum and learning opportunities for kids and for teachers is, what are people here having emotion about? What does it feel like to think about this right now? What are they having, right? What are they engaged with thinking about? Are the emotions pertaining to the ideas that are the disciplinary content, or are they the outcomes and the results of what you do? And what we suggest is that shifting so that there's a heavier focus on dispositional ways of building emotion around engagement with ideas is actually the core of high quality education, and especially so for adolescents. So here's an example of somebody. I don't know, I'm kind of running out of time here, but I'll just show you quickly. This is a young person who was part of one of these progressive performance assessment schools in New York City, where they have a disposition to not use the Regents exam and instead to have these committee-based portfolio presentations where kids are engaging deeply in their work and sharing it with other people in a process-oriented way, where they're really reflecting on, what are you accomplishing? What am I learning? What have I not done yet? Where else could I go with this? What else are my open questions? Where it's this much more situated, dynamic way of understanding. And this is a kid who had immigrated from Sudan some years earlier, had never before passed a math class. He's 18 years old in this math class, and he's at the end of the math class. And this was culled from his presentation on the last day, explaining what this math class has been like for him. So I'll let you read it. And I want you to think as you're reading about what are the instrumental pieces where you dig in, you think about things that are here and now, and how is he then shifting himself and balancing like a seesaw, right? As he shifts into, and what is the bigger idea? And how do I connect that bigger idea and the feeling of thinking about the math to the feeling of actually being me? And through doing that, he becomes intrinsically motivated and the math feels relevant to himself. So let's read it. Right, so this is walking to the door is basically Zeno's paradox. You keep getting halfway to the door, and you never reach the door, right? And so how do you solve whether you're going to reach the door? And so what he's saying here is basically he feels like he was able to think like a mathematician. The feeling of thinking about math was started to become relevant to the feeling of being him. And so what he's done, I think, is tied the, like, I have this problem, I have it, it's in me. And it makes me think about these big ideas like limits and asymptotes and infinity. But then in order to really understand them, I have to dig in and learn to do stuff, which is like fractions, right? So I have to study fractions, I have to, in order to be able to have this bigger feeling of thinking about this idea, which is deeply motivating to me. And so often in education, we put the cart before the horse. We put the building blocks, do the fractions before you think about infinity, right? And I think that that is backwards. I think that we need to offer kids the ability and the agency to think about and move themselves between doing and reflecting on the purpose and the bigger idea behind what they're doing. And as we do that, that feels like that's tickling up those salience networks that are actually the physiological feeling of me that you saw in the early data. And so it feels relevant to me, right? We often think of relevance as being applicable to your daily life. Well, how is infinity and asymptotes applicable to some Sudanese immigrant in the Bronx's daily life? It isn't. What it's applicable to is the thinking of it feels like me, because I'm tickling up these systems that are the physiological regulation of me. That's what I think. That's why it is that we as humans can become interested in all kinds of complex ideas that are actually not directly relevant to anything except to other ideas, to ways of understanding the world. And that is what deeply motivates us. We should organize our schooling around the ability and propensity to engage with that. So I'm just going to skip this. It's in the, we're going to skip that and just stop there. And thank you.
So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. If there are any questions, we can go ahead and look at those now. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A. We have about 15 minutes for that.
Got it. And I see a lot of people are just sending comments like, great presentation, thank you so much, great work, fascinating. And while people are thinking through whatever questions they might want to offer and thinking over your presentation, I have a question I'd like your perspective on. And I watched your presentation, looked at your research, and if you got it, go ahead, Steve. I missed that, sorry. If you want to repeat, Dr. Berlendi, thank you. Your research seems very close to looking at the participants and, you know, recruiting their knowledge, their thinking, their feeling. You're really listening a lot of that. At the same time, there's other research right now that relies on hyper, did you get it, Steve? Say it.
Hypersetting?
Hyperscanning, thank you.
Oh, hyperscanning, yeah.
Thank you. And so where they're looking at two at the same time in the same area, and they'll look at the students and measure multiple students at the same time and look to see if there is correlation between what's happening with each of them. And that correlation shows opportunity for learning and where learning is happening for the teacher and the students, and see whether this is happening at the same time for each. And so what is your perspective on how educators can cause, if you will, the emotional fascination, and that would bolster the students' understanding? So how do these two things, in thinking about these two types of research, how do we think about these two things in concert?
So how do we kind of reconcile those two ways of thinking about it? Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in the one case, first, when you're doing these hyperscanning experiments, the people have to be seeing exactly the same thing, right? Usually they're seeing videos or some other stimulus and they're time synced. So they're perceiving it in the same way. So it's really about what do you notice, what do you process as you are engaging with the world, which is absolutely an essential part of engaging with information so that you can learn about that information. But I think that we often forget, and so these two things are really complementary, I think, is that what does that information mean to you? What do you go on to use it for? How does it change who you are moving forward to having thought about that information? You know, it's important that we can ingest and make sense of and digest information, but we often think about the purpose of school as being mainly about the teacher knows stuff, the kids don't, and we give it one to the other. Yes, you have to be able to effectively transmit information, but the bigger question is, what is then happening in the learner and teacher in which they are enabled to sort of develop themselves in a personal way as thinkers around that information? How do they use this to be sort of civic agents in the world? How do they use this to develop a sense of identity around the learning process or commitment to a discipline of ideas, right? Like, I'm going to be a philosopher, or I'm going to be a politician, or I'm going to be a mathematician or an artist, right? We're often in our research systematically focusing on the transfer of knowledge, which is very important, but we are systematically neglecting how that knowledge then is taken in by the person so that they become somebody who is educated, right? Somebody who goes out into the world and engages with that world in ways that are ethical, responsible, nuanced, creative, innovative, productive over time as that world's evolving, and also has the ability to imagine alternative ways of doing that so that you can create a world that is better than it is now. The transfer of information doesn't capture those dispositional developmental processes. And so that's what we're trying to capture, because I think it's a false value to think that schooling, it should only be judged based on what people remember. That's factual, that they can ingest and what they can do. You have to be able to remember and do things, but let's face it, you can go on Google and look up most of what you need to know, right? What you really need is to be engaging with thinking and doing things and memorizing things in the service of growing yourself as an intellectual and civic agent, right? And so that's the transformative process that I'm trying to focus on. Does that answer the question?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Okay, there's somebody that would like to ask a question directly and is coming on screen. Hi there, can everyone see me? Good. Okay. So my question is, your study speaks to somebody watching a video with a story, and then you're documenting the students' thoughts around that and integrating that with your MRI data. And that qualitative data, and along with that more quantitative data. So I'm curious how you design that kind of study. And there must be some great challenges to that. What would be important for us to bear in mind in order to be able to do such a thing and balance the qualitative and quantitative aspects of such a study?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that's been something that, we've worked really hard on and had various kinds of, iterations on. I mean, it basically means you really need to understand the problem you're going at. What is the thing you're trying to capture, right? What is that process you're trying to capture? And then you need to, as best as you can, get people to show you their disposition toward doing that. So you don't want to try to control or constrain the aspects of their behavior and thinking that are the ones you're interested in. You want to control and constrain the aspects that are the ones you're not particularly interested in, right? So it takes a very sort of thoughtful trial and error, lots of proto studies, right, where you're trying methods to try to figure out what seems to work. And then we built out a very clearly standardized protocol, which is described in some of the studies, right, where the experimenter puts I put my arm across the paper, and I've shown them at the beginning, I'm writing exactly what you say, which is what I am writing, so that they know I'm not, right? I'm writing exactly what you say in case the video camera fails. Actually, I'm standardizing my behavior so that I'm not looking at them when they're answering, so they can feel free to respond, right? I always am wearing sort of casual clothes. I don't walk in a lab coat and say, yes, I'm Professor Immordino, we're going to talk about, right? You have to set up the laboratory and the protocol so that you are systematizing very subtly and carefully the behaviors so that you can let the people show you their sort of natural proclivity within the context that you are interested in understanding it. So you have to have really rich data. So we did, in terms of concrete things, we decided on early because it worked better. We have only real data from real protagonists in the world. There's no actors in any of the stimuli, right? Because there's nothing like a teenager thinking you're trying to yank their chain and get them to say what you want them to say to totally turn the thing off, right? These are real teenagers from around the world, a whole range of situations. What do you think? We really want to know how teenagers think about this, like you. Tell us what you think, right? And so we have this very nice protocol around that. We also have lab assistants and other people working in the lab with us who are from these kids' own neighborhoods, who are also high school kids, who are doing internships with us and who are helping with, like explaining things. So we really systematically try to break down the stigma around what's going on and what we're trying to learn from them, and really empower the kid to show us what they think about, because we make really clear we want to know, right? So those kinds of things. But then you also have to really understand, the methods, right? How to do, like in this case, like really gold standard qualitative coding methods where you have iterative reliability with multiple sources, and so we there's just no cutting corners. It's a lot of work. You transcribe the interviews in full, then you cut them all up and put them into databases with answers where nobody knows who said what, and then you give it to a bunch of undergraduates who don't know what the hypotheses are and teach them how to reliably code all these different 65 things, and then we run it, right? So you do all these things, and then you can quantify the qualitative data, and then we can basically regress those quantified data onto the neural data. And so that's basically how we do it. But it means sometimes inventing weird metrics that, that capture what you want to know, but that people don't usually do. Like the cross-cultural studies in Beijing, and Los Angeles, where we compared Beijing Normal University students and USC American students, and then also USC American students who were first generation Asian American from China, but who were born and raised or came to the US before the age of 6, actually, in that study, right? And so they are, they're in American schools, but they're being raised by parents who were born and raised to adulthood in China, right, as a middle group. So what do we have to do that? Like, it's a very interesting sort of like the neural activation patterns were the same across all the groups, right? So then the question is, well, can we invent a metric? So we did this thing where we have a real-time correlation, trial by trial, between the activity level in these regions of interest that we have theoretical neurological knowledge we want to look at, and the person's reported strength of emotion. And we look how well each of these regions' activity fluctuations is correlating with what they say they're experiencing. And what we find is that depending on your cultural background, there are systematic differences in the places in the brain that are corresponding to what you say you're feeling. So it's like the feeling process is different. So we had to map these meta-correlations onto, right? So you have to kind of think about conceptually, what do I want to know? And then how could I invent a statistic, right? I don't mean like invent new models, but I mean leverage the statistics we have to invent some kind of calculation, right? That would allow us to reveal that in a systematic way, but also be ready for a lot of pushback. Like we've had studies of inspiration, admiration for virtue versus admiration for skill, looking at the default mode activities. And people wanted to know, wait, why didn't you just have a whole bunch of people come to the lab and do all the skill stimuli, and a whole bunch of people come to the lab and do all the virtue stimuli? And then you could compare the groups. I'm like, no, that's not, they said that's a gold standard. I'm like, that's not the gold standard, that's the convention. We can't discover the real-time dynamic fluctuations of these networks in a person unless we do it this way. And they're like, oh, you know what I mean? So we often have a lot of go around with reviewers, and a lot of times reviewers actually improve the work. They help us make it clearer or something like that. But I think you really want to go at what is it I want to, what have I been noticing in the world that I want to do a systematic experiment to try to lift up? And then how would I do that in a way that once I've decided in a very biased way what it is I want to look at, that I could objectively study that, right? So that's basically what we do. It's not efficient. It takes a lot of go-arounds and trial and error until you settle into something that works. But when it works, it can be amazingly powerful. We're predicting kids' brain development across an age span that people have not found predictors for by just talking to them, right? Like, how did I know to do that? I don't know. I have 2 teenagers, right? I've spent a lot of time teaching 7th graders. I have a sense that this is what they're doing. What if, right? And then you design an experiment where you kind of get your bias out of the way and let the data speak.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
And thank you. We're now at 3:30. So our interpreters, thank you. I want to thank you as well for your work today. Thank you for our captionists working with us today. And thank you so much for your presentation. Your work is indeed fascinating. And we have thoroughly enjoyed learning more today. I wish we could watch the entirety of your presentation, but of course, time doesn't allow that today. And with that, I also want to thank all of our participants. And if anybody has other questions, please email us here at the Penn program, and we can forward those to our presenter today. Thank you again. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.